I drove 6 hours through the sweltering humidity of a Georgia summer just to walk my only daughter down the aisle. I had my best tuxedo, the one I'd bought for her high school graduation, and meticulously kept in a cedar chest hanging in the back of my 1990 Dam Ford F150. The truck rattled, and the AC was blowing nothing but lukewarm prayers, but I didn't care. I had a cashier's check for $50,000 sitting in the glove box, a wedding gift that represented 5 years of extra consulting work I'd taken on specifically for this day. I wanted her to start her new life with Jason without the shadow of a mortgage hanging over them. I wanted to be the hero one last time. But when I pulled up to the limestone pillars of the Golden Oaks Resort, I didn't find a welcoming committee or a frantic wedding coordinator. I found a security guard with a jaw like a brick and sunglasses that reflected my own aging, hopeful face back at me. He didn't ask for my invitation. He didn't ask if I was the father of the bride. He simply reached into a plastic bin and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. He held it up against the driver's side window. It was a photo of me, taken covertly a few months ago while I was working in my garden, covered in dirt and sweat, wearing a pair of faded overalls. Someone had taken a thick red marker and drawn a heavy, jagged X over my face. Beneath the photo, in bold, capitalized letters, were 4 words that felt like a physical blow to my chest. Do not admit. Remove immediately. Sir, you're blocking the flow of traffic for the real guests, the guard said, his voice as cold as the marble entrance behind him. Turn this heap around before I have it towed. I sat there, the engine of my truck idling with a rough, rhythmic thumping that seemed to mimic the breaking of my heart. I looked past the guard, up the winding, cypress-lined drive toward the grand ballroom. I could see the white silk tents and the glint of expensive champagne flutes in the distance. My daughter, Sarah, was up there. She was getting ready to start the most important day of her life, and she had spent her morning making sure the man who raised her wouldn't be allowed to see it. I didn't scream. I didn't plead. I've spent 40 years on construction sites. I know when a structure is too far gone to save. I simply nodded, put the truck in reverse, and backed away from the gate. But as I pulled onto the shoulder of the highway, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. Dad, I saw your truck on the security feed. Please, just go home. Jason's parents are here. They're different. They're sophisticated, Dad. If they see you in that truck, or if you start talking about the old days, it'll ruin the aesthetic I've worked so hard for. This is my one chance to belong. Please, don't destroy it for me. I'll send you the professional photos next month. I hope you understand. I read the message twice. The aesthetic. My existence, my calloused hands, and the truck that had carried her to every dance recital and doctor's appointment for 20 years were a blemish on her perfect world. She didn't want a father. She wanted a curated image. What Sarah didn't know what she had, never bothered to ask in her rush to join the elite, was that I wasn't just a retired foreman with a rusty truck. She saw the grease under my fingernails and assumed I was poor. She saw the cabin I lived in and assumed I was a failure. She didn't realize that the man she was so ashamed of was the same man who owned the very ground she was standing on. I pulled over at a roadside diner, ordered a black coffee, and opened my laptop. My hands were steady, but my mind was a storm of cold, hard calculations. I've always been a builder, but people forget that before you build something new, you often have to perform a controlled demolition. I pulled up my private accounts. Sarah thought Jason was paying for this $100,000 wedding. She thought his old money family was footing the bill for the Numtrama plate catering and the vintage crystal. She didn't know that the anonymous donor who had cleared the resort's invoice 3 months ago wasn't Jason's father. It was me. I'd done it because I wanted her to have the best. I'd done it because I wanted her to feel like a princess. But as I looked at the red X over my face on the security guard's clipboard, I realized I hadn't been a father to her. I'd been an ATM with a pulse. I didn't call Sarah. Instead, I called Arthur Henderson, my attorney of 30 years, and the man who managed the Carter Trust. Arthur, I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. Are you still at the office? Bill, shouldn't you be at the wedding? I thought today was the big walk down the aisle, Arthur replied, sounding confused. The walk was canceled, Arthur. I've been barred from the property. Sarah thinks I don't fit the aesthetic of her new life. There was a long, sharp silence on the other end. Arthur knew me. He knew how much I'd sacrificed for Sarah. He knew about the double shifts, the missed meals, and the way I'd poured every spare cent into her education and her comfort. "What do you want to do, Bill?" Arthur asked, his tone shifting from friendly to professional. He knew that tone in my voice. It was the tone I used right before I fired a subcontractor for cutting corners. "I want to exercise the morality and conduct clause in the sponsorship agreement for the Golden Oaks event," I said. "And Arthur, I want you to call the resort's general manager. Tell him that the anonymous benefactor has withdrawn all funding, effective immediately. And tell him that as the majority shareholder of the hospitality group that owns the resort, I want the power cut to the ballroom in exactly 1 hour." "Bill, that's the nuclear option," Arthur whispered. "The guests are already there. The food is being prepped. If you pull the plug now, the venue will have to shut down the event. They won't have the legal right to serve the meal or use the facilities without the insurance coverage provided by the contract." "I know exactly what it is," I said, watching a single tear fall onto the screen of my laptop. "She wanted a wedding without her father. She's about to get exactly what she asked for. She's going to have a wedding without a father, without a budget, and without a single light left on in the room." I hung up the phone. I didn't feel the rush of relief I expected. I just felt a deep, hollow ache. But as I sat there in that dusty diner, I realized this wasn't just about the wedding. Sarah had been lying to me for months. She'd been telling me Jason was a high-level executive at a tech firm. She'd been telling me his parents were New York socialites. I decided to do something I should have done the moment she met that man. I opened a second tab and logged into the private investigator portal I used for my business background checks. If I was going to tear down the house, I needed to see how deep the rot went. What I found in the next 20 minutes made my blood run cold. Jason wasn't an executive. His parents weren't socialites. The elite life my daughter was so desperate to protect was built on a foundation of sand and lies. I checked my watch. 45 minutes until the lights went out. I paid for my coffee, walked back to my truck, and didn't drive toward my cabin. Instead, I drove back toward the resort. I wasn't going to try to get in this time. I was just going to wait at the bottom of the hill. I wanted to be there when the fairy tale ended and the darkness began. I didn't know it yet, but the security guard with the laminated photo was the least of Sarah's problems. Within the hour, she would realize that the man she had discarded was the only thing keeping her world from collapsing, and by the time she realized it, I would be the most expensive stranger she'd ever met. I watched the clock on the dashboard tick toward the hour. Nam mui tam, nam mui chin. In the distance, the grand, illuminated Golden Oaks sign atop the hill flickered once, twice, and then vanished. The resort was plunged into a total, suffocating blackness. My phone started ringing. It was Sarah. I didn't answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then I turned the phone off and placed it on the passenger seat. The aesthetic was finally ruined. Now, the real story was beginning. The silence that followed the blackout was a heavy, suffocating thing. From my vantage point at the bottom of the hill, the Golden Oaks Resort looked like a tomb carved out of the Georgia night. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, the metal cold through my jeans, and watched the tiny, frantic glimmers of cell phone flashlights begin to dance behind the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom. They looked like fireflies trapped in a jar, desperate and small. I knew that up there, panic was setting in. I knew the kitchen staff was frozen mid-plating, the band's instruments were silent, and the air conditioning, that invisible shield against the southern heat, had died. I took a slow breath, the humid air smelling of pine and impending rain. It's funny how a man's mind works when he finally lets go of a burden he's been carrying for too long. Instead of feeling guilty, I felt a strange, clinical clarity. I started thinking about the foundation of all this. You don't get to a moment like this, a father sabotaging his own daughter's wedding without years of structural failure. In construction, they tell you that if the house leans, don't look at the roof, look at the dirt. The dirt, in this case, went back 29 years to the day Sarah was born. Her mother, Catherine, had been the heart of everything. She was the one who kept the books, while I stayed on the job sites until my boots were caked in red clay, and my back felt like it was made of rusted rebar. We lived in a small, 2-bedroom bungalow back then, and every cent we made that didn't go to mortgage or milk went into a high-yield account we called the Miracle Fund. We wanted Sarah to have the life we didn't, the kind where you don't have to check the price of eggs or worry if the transmission on the truck will last another winter. When Catherine passed away 10 years ago, the light in our house didn't just dim, it went out. Sarah was 19, just starting college, and she took it hard. But instead of drawing closer to me, she started to drift. I thought it was just grief. I thought if I provided more, if I made her life easier, she'd find her way back. So, I worked harder. I took my small construction firm and turned it into a powerhouse. I didn't tell her when I sold the company for $8 million. I didn't tell her when I started buying up land and commercial leases. I kept living in our old cabin, driving the same truck, and wearing the same work shirts. I wanted her to love me for the man I was, not the balance in my bank account. I should have seen the crack in the foundation then, but I was too busy trying to keep the roof over her head. The first real warning sign came 3 years ago when she introduced me to Jason Miller. She brought him to the cabin for dinner. I'd spent the whole day smoking a brisket and cleaning the place up, but the moment they stepped out of his leased BMW, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Jason was polished, too polished. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his teeth were blindingly white, and his suit cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. "So, this is the rustic retreat Sarah told me about," Jason had said, not even bothering to shake my hand. He looked at the mounted deer head on the wall and the worn leather recliner as if he'd just stepped into a museum of poverty. Sarah laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound I'd never heard from her before. "I keep telling him he needs to move into one of those luxury condos downtown, Jason. But you know, Dad, he likes his dirt." I'd stood there in my kitchen, holding a tray of cornbread, and felt like a stranger in my own home. That night, Jason spent 3 hours talking about disruptive technology and capital liquefaction. He spoke over me, corrected my grammar, and treated me like a simple-minded janitor who had accidentally wandered into his presence. And the worst part? Sarah watched him with eyes full of worship. She'd spent her whole life seeing me build skyscrapers and bridges, but she was enamored with a man who built nothing but spreadsheets. "He's a visionary, Dad," she'd told me later, while we were washing the dishes. "His family is incredible. His father is a retired diplomat, and his mother is a philanthropist. They have this estate in Connecticut that makes this place look like a tool shed. I finally feel like I'm moving into the world where I belong." I didn't have the heart to tell her that belonging shouldn't require making your father feel like a footstool. But then the money started disappearing. It started small, a $5,000 loan for an investment Jason was spearheading, then $10,000 for a bridge loan because his family's assets were tied up in European trusts. Every time, Sarah would come to me with a story about how Jason was on the verge of a breakthrough, how they just needed a little more runway. I gave it to her. Not because I believed in Jason, but because I wanted to buy the right to see my daughter. Each check was a ransom payment for her time. But 6 months ago, the tension finally reached its breaking point. I'd invited them over for what I thought was a celebration of their engagement. I'd even bought a bottle of expensive champagne, the kind Jason usually bragged about. Halfway through dinner, Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a brochure for a high-end retirement community 3 states away. "Bill, we've been talking," Jason said, sliding the glossy paper across the table. "Once Sarah and I are married, the optics are going to be very important. We'll be hosting a lot of high-net-worth individuals. It's going to be hard to explain. Well, all of this." He waved a hand vaguely at my home. "We think it's best if you sell this place and relocate. This community in Florida is top tier. You'll be with people of your own background. It'll be cleaner for everyone." I looked at Sarah. I expected her to be outraged. I expected her to tell him to get out. Instead, she wouldn't look me in the eye. She just toyed with her salad and nodded softly. "It's about the brand, Dad. Jason's family is very particular about their associations. If his father sees you like this, it could jeopardize Jason's standing in the firm. We just want you to be comfortable somewhere else." That was the first time I felt the cold anger take root. It wasn't just that they were ashamed of me. They were trying to evict me from my own life to protect a lie they were telling themselves. I'd smiled that night, tucked the brochure into my pocket, and told them I'd think about it. But the next morning, I called a private investigator named Reynolds. If Jason's family was so sophisticated, I wanted to know exactly what kind of pedigree I was dealing with. I'm a builder. I know that the most beautiful facades often hide the worst termite damage. Reynolds called me back 10 days later. "Bill," he said, his voice crackling over the line, "you might want to sit down for this. Your future son-in-law. He's not a visionary. He's a professional ghost." According to Reynolds, Jason Miller didn't have a tech firm. He had a series of shell companies that had all filed for bankruptcy within 18 months of opening. His diplomat father was actually a disgraced insurance salesman living in a trailer park outside of Reno, and his philanthropist mother had a rap sheet for check kiting. They didn't have an estate in Connecticut. They had a mountain of debt and 3 different aliases. But the real kicker was the wedding. Jason had convinced Sarah that his family was paying for the Golden Oaks Resort. He told her it was their wedding gift to the couple. In reality, Jason had been intercepting the loans I'd been giving Sarah and using them to pay off his gambling debts. The wedding wasn't paid for. The resort had been sending increasingly frantic notices of cancellation. That was when I stepped in. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't confront Jason. I quietly contacted the resort management and told them I was the anonymous benefactor. I paid the hai chum mui hai home balance in full, but I had Arthur add a very specific rider to the contract. Clause mui bong si. The benefactor reserves the right to terminate all services and funding instantly without refund if the benefactor is treated with indignity or barred from the proceedings by the beneficiaries. I wanted to believe she wouldn't do it. I wanted to believe that on her big day, she'd realize her father was more important than the aesthetic. I spent $200,000 just to give her the chance to be a good daughter. But then I saw the laminated photo. I saw the red X. I saw the security guard's smug face as he told me I was ruining the look. I looked up at the darkened ballroom now, the moonlight catching the edges of the white silk tents. My phone buzzed again in the silence. It was a call from Sarah, then a call from Jason, then a call from a number I didn't recognize, likely the resort manager. I didn't answer any of them. I just sat there, listening to the crickets and the distant, muffled sound of people shouting in the dark. I thought about Jason's sophisticated parents. Reynolds had told me they were arriving this morning. I'd seen them earlier, through the gates, a well-dressed couple in their 60s, looking every bit the part of New England royalty. I wondered how they were enjoying the darkness. I wondered if they knew that the tech mogul they'd raised was currently trapped in a room he couldn't pay for, surrounded by guests who were about to realize they weren't getting dinner. What happened next was the part I hadn't fully planned for, but the part that would change everything. A sleek, black SUV pulled up to the security gate, not 50 yards from where I was parked. 2 men in dark suits got out. They didn't look like wedding guests. They looked like the kind of men who come to collect things that don't belong to them. I watched them talk to the flustered security guard. Even from here, I could see the guard was shaking. The men weren't there for the party. They were looking for Jason. I leaned back against the cab of my truck and realized that the aesthetic wasn't the only thing Sarah was about to lose. She'd invited a vulture into our lives, and she'd locked the only man who could fight him off outside the gate. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I had one more call to make. "Reynolds," I said when the PI picked up. "Are you still near the resort?" "I'm in the parking lot, Bill. It's a madhouse. The lights are out and people are starting to bail. Some of the guests are literally climbing over the fences to get to their cars." "Good," I said. "Keep your eyes on those 2 men in the black SUV at the front gate. And Reynolds, I want you to start the live stream. If the world is going to see my daughter's perfect wedding, I want them to see the whole thing. Especially the part where the groom's past finally catches up to his present." I hung up and looked at the dark hill one last time. I'd spent my life building things up. It was time to see how quickly a lie could fall apart when the lights went out. What Sarah didn't know yet was that Jason hadn't just lied about his parents. He'd lied about why he needed that $50,000 in the glove box of my truck. And the men in the SUV weren't the only ones looking for him. The 2 men in the black SUV didn't look like they belonged in a place called Golden Oaks. They didn't have the soft, pampered look of the country club set. They had the thick necks and the dead eyes of men who spent their lives enforcing the kind of contracts that don't get written on paper. I watched them through the rearview mirror as they leaned over the security guard's booth. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the guard's posture wilt. He wasn't checking a guest list anymore. He was pointing up the hill toward the darkened ballroom with a trembling hand. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes for a second, the hum of the night air filling the cab. I should have been surprised to see loan sharks at my daughter's wedding. But the truth was, I'd been expecting this since last Thanksgiving. That was the day the mask didn't just slip, it fell off and shattered on my kitchen floor. Sarah and Jason had come up for the holiday, but they didn't bring a turkey or a side dish. They brought a thick stack of legal documents. We were sitting at the same oak table where Sarah used to do her homework, The table I'd built for Catherine when we were 22. Jason didn't even wait for the pie before he started his pitch. "Bill, we've been looking at your portfolio," Jason had said, his voice smooth as grease. "You've got a lot of equity tied up in this land and that apartment block downtown. It's stagnant. It's old money. If you let me roll that into a Series B funding round for Nebulous, we can quadruple your net worth by the time the first child arrives. You want your grandkids to be born into a legacy, don't you?" I'd looked at Sarah, hoping to see a spark of the girl who used to help me measure joists on Saturday mornings. But she was just nodding, her eyes fixed on the diamonds Jason had bought her. Diamonds, I later found out, were charged to a credit card he'd opened in her name without telling her. "Dad, it's for us," she'd said, her voice sounding like a script. "Jason is a genius. Everyone says so. You're stuck in the past. You think wealth is about bricks and mortar, but it's about movement. If you don't sign these papers, you're basically telling me you don't trust my judgment. You're telling me you don't want me to have a future." I'd told them I needed to talk to my accountant. Jason's face had turned a shade of red that wasn't healthy. He'd slammed his hand on the table, my table, and hissed, "We don't have time for accountants, Bill. The window is closing. Do you want to be a part of this family, or just a spectator?" I'd looked at him and said, "I've never been a spectator in my life, son." I didn't sign, and from that day on, I became the problem. I became the obstacle to their ascension. Sarah stopped calling to check on me. She only called to ask for advances on her inheritance. Every time I said no, the aesthetic of our relationship grew colder. I was being phased out, brick by brick, until I was nothing more than an embarrassing memory of a life she wanted to forget. I opened my eyes and looked at the tablet propped up on my dashboard. Reynolds's live stream was active. The PI was a ghost in the shadows of the resort's veranda, using a high-end thermal lens that made the darkened ballroom look like a world of ghostly greens and grays. The scene was pure, unadulterated chaos. In the infrared glow, I could see the sophisticated guests stumbling over chairs, their formal wear snagging on floral arrangements. The namui, worth of white orchids I'd paid for, were being trampled by people who, 5 minutes ago, were laughing about their summer homes. I saw Sarah. She was standing in the center of the dance floor, her white dress glowing like a beacon in the thermal feed. She was clutching her phone, probably still trying to call me. Jason was next to her, but he wasn't comforting her. He was pacing, his hands buried in his hair, his mouth moving in a silent, frantic rhythm. Even through a grainy digital feed, I could see a man who knew the walls were closing in. Suddenly, the sophisticated parents, the ones Sarah was so afraid I'd offend, stepped into the frame. Reynolds' voice whispered through the tablet speakers. "Bill, check the audio on channel 2. I've got a parabolic mic aimed at the head table." I turned up the volume. The sound of the wind was replaced by the muffled, sharp tones of Jason's mother, or the woman Sarah thought was his mother. "Jason, we are done," the woman hissed. Her Connecticut accent was gone, replaced by a harsh, nasal rasp that sounded like it belonged in a bus station. "The power is out, the bar is closed, and those guys in the SUV just cleared the gate. You told us this was a done deal. You told us the old man's check would clear this morning." "It did clear," Jason whispered back, his voice cracked with panic. "The resort took the money. I saw the confirmation." "Then why did the lights go out?" the father demanded, stepping closer to Jason. He didn't look like a retired diplomat anymore. He looked like a man who was afraid of going back to a cell. "If the funding was pulled, that means the old man knows, and if he knows, we're out of here. I'm not sticking around to explain to a sheriff why my ID says I'm a diplomat when I've got 3 warrants in Ohio." I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. Reynolds had told me they were actors, but hearing them discuss warrants, they weren't just hired talent, they were Jason's associates. The whole thing was a long con, and my daughter was the mark. On the screen, Sarah stepped toward them, her face a mask of confusion. "What are you talking about? Warrants? Jason, who are these people?" Jason spun around, and for the first time, I saw the true face of the man my daughter had chosen. He didn't look at her with love, he looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Not now, Sarah," he barked, shoving her hand away. "Just stay there and look pretty. That's the only thing you're good for anyway." Sarah recoiled as if he'd slapped her. She looked around the darkened room, at the guests who were now more interested in finding the exit than in her perfect day. She looked at the fake parents who were already starting to edge toward the service doors. I sat in my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs. Part of me wanted to roar up that hill, break through the doors, and tear Jason apart. But I knew that if I saved her now, she'd never see the truth. She'd blame the accident. She'd blame the power company. She'd blame me. She had to see the whole house fall. "Bill," Reynolds whispered again. "The guys from the SUV are in the lobby. They're asking the manager for the bridal suite number. They don't look like they're here for a slice of cake." "Let them in, Reynolds," I said, my voice thick. "And keep the camera on Jason. I want to see his face when he realizes the aesthetic just turned into a crime scene." What happened next was something I hadn't expected. Sarah didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She stood there in the center of that ruined ballroom, the infrared light making her look like a statue. She looked at Jason, then at his parents, and then she did something that made me hold my breath. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out the small, velvet-lined box that was supposed to hold their wedding bands. She looked at the rings, then looked at the service door where the men in the black SUV were about to emerge. I didn't know it yet, but Sarah had been keeping a secret of her own. She hadn't just been taking loans from me for Jason's investments. She had been doing her own math, and she was about to reveal a twist that even I hadn't seen coming. "Jason," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly clear through the mic, "before those men get here, I think there's something you should know about the $50,000 my father gave me this morning." I sat up straight, my eyes glued to the screen. What 50,000? The check was in my glove box. On the screen, the service doors burst open. The two men from the SUV stepped into the ballroom, their silhouettes looming large against the emergency exit signs. "Jason Miller," the larger one called out, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "We've been looking for you, and we hear you've got something that belongs to our boss." Jason froze. Sarah didn't. She turned to the men, the velvet box in her hand, and smiled. It was a smile that didn't belong on a bride's face. It was the smile of a woman who had finally learned how to build something of her own out of pure, cold-blooded revenge. What happened in the next 10 seconds changed the entire trajectory of the night. I thought I was the one in control of the demolition, but I'd forgotten one thing. I'd raised a Carter. And Carters never go down without taking the whole building with them. I sat in the dim light of my truck's cabin, the glow of the tablet reflecting in my eyes, feeling like a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. When Sarah spoke about that $50,000, my heart skipped a beat. I reached over and threw open my glove box. The leather-bound folder was still there. The cashier's check, crisp and untouched, sat right on top. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. If I had the real check, what was Sarah holding? On the screen, the two men from the SUV men Reynolds had identified as Vinny, and the hammer didn't stop. They moved with a slow, predatory rhythm, stepping over a collapsed floral arrangement as they neared the head table. The guests nearest them were scrambling away, pushing through the darkness, desperate to reach the exits. The resort was no longer a place of luxury. It was a cage. Jason looked like he was about to faint. He was sweating so profusely that his silk shirt was clinging to his chest, translucent and ugly. He looked at the men, then at Sarah, his eyes darting like a cornered rat. "Sarah, give them the check," Jason hissed, his voice cracking. "Give it to them right now. You heard them. It's for their boss. It'll cover the bridge loan. It'll save us." Sarah didn't move. She stood perfectly still as the larger of the two men, Vinny, reached the edge of the dance floor. He was wearing a gray suit that looked cheap compared to the surroundings, but he carried a weight that made the room feel small. He stopped 10 feet from the bride, his eyes fixed on the velvet box in her hand. "A check?" Vinny said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the muffled sounds of the panicked crowd. "Jason, you told us you'd have the cash. You said the old man was a walking vault. You didn't say nothing about a check we gotta wait to clear." "It's a cashier's check," Jason screamed, stepping behind Sarah, literally using her as a human shield. He placed his hands on her shoulders, but it wasn't a gesture of comfort, it was a shove. "It's as good as gold. Her dad is William Carter. He's worth millions. He gave it to her this morning." I watched Sarah's face in the thermal feed. She didn't flinch when Jason pushed her. She didn't look back at him. She just looked at Vinny. "My father did give me a gift this morning," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm. "But it wasn't a check for $50,000. It was a realization." She flipped open the velvet box. It didn't contain wedding bands. It was empty, save for a small, folded piece of paper. "What is that?" Jason yelled, his voice rising to a frantic shriek. "Sarah, where is the check? I saw you in the truck. I saw him hand you the folder." Sarah turned then, looking at the man she had called her visionary husband. The aesthetic she had died for was gone. Her hair was starting to frizz in the Georgia humidity, her makeup was beginning to run, and the darkness of the ballroom seemed to be swallowing her whole. "I took the folder out of your bag last night, Jason," she said. "I saw the notes you'd written in the margins of the wedding planner's book. I saw the phone numbers for the investors you were supposed to be meeting. I called them. Do you know who answered? A collection agency in New Jersey. And a man who told me that if I didn't get you to pay your markers, I'd be a very young widow." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the guests who were still in the room stopped their whispering. Jason's hands dropped from her shoulders. He looked at her as if she were a stranger. You went through my things? After everything I've done for you? After the life I promised you?" "The life you promised me was a lie," Sarah replied, and for the first time, I saw the fire I'd raised her with. "You didn't want a wife, Jason. You wanted a cosigner. You wanted my dad's land and his dignity. You wanted to use me as a shield against the people you were too much of a coward to face." She turned back to Vinny and held out the piece of paper. "This isn't a check. It's a list of every shell company Jason has opened in the last 2 years. It's a list of the bank accounts he's been funneling loan money into accounts. I managed to freeze this afternoon using my father's power of attorney. There is no $50,000. There is no old money inheritance coming. There is only a bankrupt man in a rented suit." Vinny stepped forward and snatched the paper. He didn't even look at it. He just crumpled it in his fist. "Jason," Vinny said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a death sentence. "You lied to us. You said the wedding was the payoff. You said the father-in-law was the bank. I can get it," Jason stammered, backing away toward the service kitchen. Bill is right outside. He's in the truck. He has the check. I saw it." I felt a surge of adrenaline. Jason was going to lead them right to me. I reached for the ignition, ready to pull away, but then I stopped. If I left, I was leaving Sarah in that room with 3 desperate men. "Reynolds," I whispered into the mic, "are you seeing this? If they lay a hand on her, I don't care about the aesthetic. You pull that piece you carry, and you get her out of there." "I'm on it, Bill," Reynolds' voice crackled back. "But look at Sarah. She's not scared." I looked back at the screen. Sarah wasn't backing away. In fact, she was stepping toward Vinny. "He's right about one thing," Sarah said, pointing a finger at Jason. "My father is outside, and he is a very wealthy man, but he's also a man who knows how to handle people like you. He's been dealing with tough crews and crooked contractors for 40 years. If you want to get paid, you're looking at the wrong person." Jason saw his opening. He saw that the men were distracted by Sarah's words. He turned and bolted for the kitchen doors, his patent leather shoes slipping on the polished floor. "Get him," Vinny barked. The hammer moved with surprising speed, catching Jason by the collar of his tuxedo just as he reached the swinging doors. The sound of Jason's expensive fabric ripping echoed through the ballroom. He was hauled back, kicking and screaming, like a child being dragged to bed. The guests who were still trapped in the room began to scream. It was no longer a wedding. It was a kidnapping. "Wait," Sarah shouted. The hammer stopped, Jason dangling from his grip. Vinny turned to look at the bride. "You said your dad has the money," Vinny said. "Maybe we should go talk to him. Maybe he'll be more sophisticated than the groom." Sarah shook her head. "My father doesn't pay for garbage. And Jason? He's garbage. But I'll tell you what I will do. I have the keys to the BMW in my bag. It's a lease, but it's paid up for 6 months. And I have the jewelry Jason bought me, the stuff that actually has a resale value. Take it all. Take him. Just leave my father out of this." I felt a lump form in my throat. She was trying to protect me. Even after she'd banned me, even after she'd treated me like an embarrassment, her first instinct when the wolves arrived was to keep them away from my door. But Jason, in his cowardice, had one more card to play. "The truck," Jason screamed, his face turning purple as the hammer squeezed his neck. "Bill has a safe in the truck. I saw him putting a folder in there. It's not just the check. It's the deeds to the apartment complexes. They're worth millions. Sarah, tell them where the keys are." Vinny's eyes lit up. A check was one thing, but deeds? Property? That was real money. That was the kind of leverage his boss could use for years. Vinny turned to the windows, looking out toward the driveway where my truck was parked. I knew he couldn't see me through the tinted glass and the darkness, but I felt his gaze like a physical weight. "The truck," Huh? Vinny mused. He looked at Sarah. Where are the keys, princess? I don't know, Sarah said, but her voice wavered for the first time. I think you do, Vinny said. He reached out and grabbed Sarah's arm. Not roughly, but with enough force to show her he wasn't playing. Let's go for a walk. We're gonna go see Dad. We're gonna have a little family meeting. Let her go, I roared, forgetting that they couldn't hear me. I threw open the truck door and stepped out into the humid night. The security guard at the gate saw me move. He started to say something, to tell me to get back, but I didn't even look at him. I reached into the bed of my truck and pulled out a 30-inch steel pry bar I'd kept back there since the 90s. I'm 72 years old. My knees ache when it rains, and my heart isn't what it used to be, but I've spent my life breaking rock and pouring steel. I've faced down union thugs and crooked inspectors, and if these bastards thought they were going to use my daughter to get to my life's work, they were about to find out exactly why they call me the Builder. I started walking up the hill. Reynolds, I said into the hands-free mic still clipped to my ear. Call the sheriff. Tell them there's an armed robbery in progress at Golden Oaks, and tell them to bring a medic. Because I'm not waiting for the sirens. I reached the grand entrance just as the service doors burst open. Vinny was leading the way, his hand wrapped tight around Sarah's arm. Behind them, the hammer was dragging a sobbing, pleading Jason by his hair. The emergency lights of the resort flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone steps. Vinny stopped when he saw me. He looked at my old truck, my worn work boots, and the steel bar in my hand. He started to laugh. This is him? Vinny asked, looking back at Jason. This is the walking vault? He looks like he's one bad windstorm away from the nursing home. I didn't say a word. I just kept walking, my boots crunching on the gravel. I could see Sarah's eyes. She was terrified, but when she saw me, something changed. The shame I'd seen in her eyes for the last 3 years evaporated. Dad, go, she screamed. They have guns. Just drive away. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah, I said, stopping 10 feet from Vinny. I leveled the pry bar at his chest. Let my daughter go, now. Vinny reached into his jacket, his hand hovering over the grip of a pistol. You got the deeds, old man? You got the check? Give 'em over, and maybe we let the girl go home. The groom? He's coming with us. We got a lot of interest to calculate. I looked at Jason. He was blubbering, his face a mess of snot and tears. Bill, please, give it to them. It's just paper. I'll pay you back, I swear. I looked at Vinny. You want the deeds? Every single one, Vinny said, a smug grin spreading across his face. All right, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my key fob. I pressed the button, and the lights on my truck flashed in the distance. They're in the safe, but there's a problem. What problem? Vinny snapped. The safe is biometric, I lied, my voice steady as a heartbeat. It only opens for me, and if you shoot me, you'll never see a dime. Those properties are tied up in a trust that dissolves the second I stop breathing. You'll be holding a handful of worthless paper. Vinny hesitated. He was a shark, but he wasn't a fool. He knew how trusts worked. He looked at the hammer, then back at me. Fine, Vinny said, shoving Sarah toward me. Open the safe. But if I see you reach for anything but those papers, I'm going to put a hole in the groom, and then I'm going to come for the girl. Sarah stumbled into my arms. She was shaking, her white dress stained with dirt from the walk out of the ballroom. I held her tight for a second, the first time I'd held her in years. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered into my chest. I'm so sorry. Not now, Sarah, I said, my eyes never leaving Vinny. We've still got to finish the aesthetic. I led them toward the truck, but I didn't go to the glove box. I went to the back, toward the heavy, steel-lidded toolbox, bolted to the bed. What Vinny didn't know was that there were no deeds in that truck. There were no millions in paper. But there was something I'd been holding on to for a very long time, a secret that Jason had been desperately trying to find, and a truth that was about to blow the entire sophisticated world of Golden Oaks wide open. Open it, Vinny commanded, his gun now visible in his hand. I reached for the handle of the toolbox, but I didn't open it. I turned to Jason, who was standing between the two loan sharks, looking like the ghost of a man. Jason, I said, before I give them what's in here, why don't you tell Sarah who hired these men? Why don't you tell her who really leaked your debt to Vinny's boss? Jason's eyes went wide. He looked at me, then at the men, and the color drained from his face until he was whiter than Sarah's dress. You didn't know it yet, Sarah, I said, my hand tightening on the handle. "But your husband wasn't the only one playing a game. And what's in this box? It's not money. It's the end of everything." Vinny didn't like the way I was looking at him. He was a man who lived on the fear of others, a bottom feeder who grew fat on the desperation of gamblers and losers. But as I stood there, my hand resting on the cold, diamond-plated steel of my truck's toolbox, I wasn't showing him fear. I was showing him the same calm, detached focus I used when I had to tell a crew that a 5-story wall was 2 inches out of plumb. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and the coming rain. Behind us, the Golden Oaks Resort was still a dark monolith, but the sound of shouting had drifted into a chaotic, distant roar. The aesthetic was dead. The sophisticated guests were probably fighting over their valeted Teslas in the dark. "Open the damn box, old man," Vinny hissed, the muzzle of his pistol glinting under the yellow glow of the security light. "And Jason? If he's lying to me, I'm going to let the hammer use his fingers for percussion." Jason let out a pathetic, stifled whimper. He was pinned against the side of my truck by the hammer, his $1,000 tuxedo jacket now just a shredded rag of silk and ego. I looked at him, then at the parents, Gary and Linda, who were trying to sneak toward their rented sedan 20 yards away. "Wait just a minute, Gary," I called out, my voice cutting through the humidity like a saw blade. "You don't want to leave before the final act. You're the one who started this, aren't you?" The fake father froze. He turned around, his face pale, the diplomat mask finally discarded. He looked at Vinny, then at me. "I don't know what you're talking about, Carter. We were just hired for a gig. We're leaving." "He's the one, Vinny," I said, pointing the pry bar toward Gary. "You want to know how you found out Jason was here tonight? You want to know who told you about the old man with the walking vault?" Vinny narrowed his eyes, glancing at Gary. "The tip was anonymous, a phone call from a burner. It was Gary," I said, leaning against the bed of the truck. "Jason's check to the acting agency bounced last night. Gary realized the whole thing was a sinking ship. He figured if he couldn't get his $3,000 fee, he could at least get a finder's fee from your boss for delivering Jason on a silver platter. He didn't want the aesthetic, Sarah. He wanted a commission." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Gary, the man she had treated with such reverence all day, and saw him for what he was. A petty informant in a rented suit. You called them?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "You put us in danger because of $3,000? "It's a business, honey," Gary spat, his voice dropping the New England polish. "Your husband is a fraud. He was never going to pay us. I just balanced the books." Vinny's face twisted into a mask of irritation. He didn't like being a pawn in someone else's side hustle. He turned the gun back to me. "I don't care about the actors. I want the deeds. Open the box, or the girl gets a new set of problems." I didn't argue. I reached for the latch. "I told you it was biometric, Vinny. That was a lie to get you out of that room. I didn't want my daughter being caught in the crossfire when the sheriff showed up." "The sheriff?" The hammer growled, his grip tightening on Jason's neck. "They're on their way," I said calmly. "But you've got 5 minutes. That's plenty of time for you to see what's really in here." I flipped the heavy steel lid of the toolbox. It groaned on its hinges, a sound that felt final. Inside, there were no deeds. There were no stacks of cash. There was only a thick, black leather accordion file and an old, battered digital recorder, the kind I used for taking notes on job sites. I pulled out the file and tossed it onto the tailgate. "What is that?" Vinny demanded, stepping closer, his gun still leveled at my chest. "That," I said, "is the reason Jason didn't want me at this wedding. It's not because of the truck, Sarah. It's not because of my overalls. It's because he knew that if I was in the room, I might start talking to people. I might start asking questions about the nebulous merger." I looked at Sarah, whose eyes were darting between me and the file. "Jason told you he was investing your money, didn't he?" I asked her. "He told you he was building a legacy for us." He said we were partners," Sarah whispered. "Take a look at the third tab in that file, Sarah," I said. Vinny watched her like a hawk as she reached for the folder. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely flip the pages. When she found the tab, she stopped. She pulled out a stack of documents, not deeds, but loan applications. "These are signatures," Sarah said, her voice barely a breath. "These are my signatures, but I never signed these. This is for a $300,000 predatory loan against my future inheritance. And this is a power of attorney form." He didn't just steal my money, Sarah, I said, my voice heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with the wedding. He stole your identity. He's been forging your name for 18 months. Every time you thought you were signing a wedding permit or a rental agreement, you were signing away your life. He wasn't building an empire. He was building a cage, and he was planning to lock the door the second the honeymoon started. Sarah looked at Jason. The man who had been her world looked like a shriveled thing, a hollow husk of a human being. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Jason didn't answer. He just sobbed, the sound muffled by the hammer's forearm. "But that's not the best part, Vinny," I said, turning my attention back to the shark. "You see, Jason told you I had the deeds in the truck. He told you I was the bank. But what he didn't tell you is that I've been onto him for months. I didn't just hire a PI to check his background. I hired a forensic accountant to track every penny he stole. I picked up the digital recorder and pressed play. A voice filled the air, tinny, distorted, but unmistakably Jason's. It was a recording from a week ago, likely from a bug Reynolds had planted in Jason's office. Yeah, the old man is a dinosaur. He's got millions sitting in stagnant land trusts. Once the wedding is over and I've got Sarah locked in, I'll have the POA active. I'll liquidate the Carter Holdings before he even realizes the lights are out. If he makes a move, I'll just tell the cops he's senile. He lives in a shack, for God's sake. Who's gonna believe a hillbilly over a CEO? The recording continued, Jason laughing as he discussed how he was going to dump the girl once the assets were laundered through a crypto exchange in the Caymans. He talked about Sarah like she was a piece of equipment he was planning to trade in for a newer model. Sarah stood there, the papers fluttering in her hands, her world dissolving into the red Georgia clay. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had abandoned her father for, and saw a monster. Vinny, however, wasn't interested in the emotional weight of the betrayal. He was a businessman, and he realized that the walking vault he'd been promised was actually a fortress he couldn't breach. "So there's no money," Vinny said, his voice turning cold. "There's no deeds. You just brought us out here to listen to a podcast." "Oh, there's money," I said, reaching back into the toolbox. I pulled out a small, heavy GPS tracker and held it up. "But it's not in my truck. It's in the spare tire of that black SUV you're driving. I had Reynolds plant it 3 hours ago." Vinny froze. "What?" "I knew you were coming, Vinny," I said, stepping away from the truck, pulling Sarah with me. "I knew Jason had tipped you off. I knew you'd try to use her to get to me. So, I made a deal of my own. I called your boss, not the guy you work for, the guy he works for, Mr. Moretti." Vinny's face went from pale to ghostly white. Moretti was a name you didn't say out loud in this state unless you were looking for a permanent residence in the Pine Barrens. "I told Moretti that you and the Hammer were planning to skim off the top of this collection," I lied, my voice filled with a conviction that made Vinny's hand shake. "I told him you were planning to take the deeds for yourselves and disappear. Why do you think he hasn't answered your texts for the last hour?" The panic in Vinny's eyes was the most satisfying thing I'd ever seen. He looked at the Hammer, who was already starting to loosen his grip on Jason. "He's lying," Jason screamed, sensing the shift in power. "He's a construction worker. He doesn't know Moretti." "I built Moretti's hunting lodge in Hingin-les-Bains, Jason," I said, not taking my eyes off Vinny. "And I've been paying his union dues on my job sites for 20 years. We have a very clear understanding. I don't mess with his business, and he doesn't let his dogs bite my family." I didn't know it yet, but that lie was the only thing standing between us and a bullet. I didn't know Moretti. I'd never built a lodge for him. But in the world of shadows, a convincing lie is often stronger than the truth. Suddenly, the sound of a distant siren began to wail, echoing off the hills of the resort. "That's the sheriff," I said. "And they're not coming for a noise complaint. They're coming for a kidnapping and armed robbery. If I were you, Vinny, I'd take that SUV and drive until the tires melt, because if the cops don't get you, Moretti's real associates will." Vinny didn't hesitate. He wasn't going to bet his life on the word of a man like Jason. He shoved his gun into his waistband and barked at the Hammer. "Move. Now." They didn't even look at Jason. They tossed him aside like a piece of trash and sprinted for their SUV. Within seconds, the tires were screaming on the gravel as they tore down the drive, disappearing into the darkness. Jason lay in the dirt, gasping for air, looking up at us. "Sarah." He wheezed, reaching out a hand. "Sarah, help me. They're gonna kill me. Your dad. He's crazy. He's gonna ruin everything. Tell them it was a mistake." Sarah looked down at him. She didn't move to help him. She didn't cry. She just looked at the dirt on her white dress, the dress he had told her was essential for the aesthetic. "My dad didn't ruin anything, Jason," she said, her voice cold and hollow. "He just turned the lights on, and I hate what I see." I put my arm around her, feeling the tremors finally start to take hold of her body. "It's over, honey. Let's go." "No," she said, pulling away slightly. She looked toward the darkened resort, then back at the road where the sirens were getting louder. "It's not over. There's one more thing we have to do." "What's that?" I asked. "The photos," she said, a dark glint appearing in her eyes. "You said Reynolds was live streaming? I want the world to see what the sophisticated elite look like when the money runs out. I want them to see Gary and Linda. I want them to see the truth." I looked at my daughter and realized that she wasn't just a Carter, she was my daughter. She was ready to finish the demolition. But as we turned to walk back toward the resort, I saw something in the rearview mirror that stopped me cold. The fake parents, Gary and Linda, weren't in their car. They were standing by the gate, talking to a third man, someone I hadn't seen before, someone who wasn't a loan shark and wasn't a guest. He was holding a camera, but not like a guest. He was holding it like a weapon. I didn't know it yet, I whispered to myself, but the con was much, much bigger than Jason Miller. The real betrayal wasn't the wedding. It was the reason the wedding existed in the first place. And, as the sheriff's lights finally crested the hill, I realized that the house hadn't just fallen, it had been rigged to explode. The red and blue strobes of the sheriff's cruisers crested the hill, reflecting off the darkened windows of the resort like a rhythmic, neon heartbeat. For a second, the light made everything look like a disco, a cruel parody of the party that was supposed to be happening inside. Jason was still curled in the gravel near the front tires of my truck, clutching his stomach and sobbing about his ribs. He looked like a discarded heap of laundry, nothing like the man who had stood at the altar an hour ago promising to protect my daughter. I kept my arm around Sarah, feeling her weight lean into me. She was cold, shivering despite the humid air, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. She wasn't looking at Jason. She was staring at Gary and Linda, the fake parents, who were now standing by the security gate with that third man, the one with the professional-grade camera. I didn't know it yet, but the loan sharks were the least of the snakes in the grass that night. The sheriff, a man named Miller, who I'd known since he was a deputy, stepped out of his car with his hand on his holster. He looked at the chaos, at the dark resort, and then at me. "Bill, what in the hell is going on here?" The dispatcher said something about a riot and a kidnapping. "It's a long story, Sam," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a mile away. "But you can start by picking up that piece of trash in the dirt. He's been forging my daughter's name on predatory loans. And those three over by the gate? You might want to secure that camera." I have a feeling the aesthetic tonight was being filmed for a very specific audience. Jason let out a howl of protest. "He's lying. He's crazy. He's been holding us hostage. He cut the power to the whole resort. Look at my face, Sheriff. He let those thugs beat me." Sam looked at Jason's pristine face. Vinny and the hammer hadn't actually hit him. They'd just scared the soul out of him, and then looked at Sarah's torn dress and bloody hands. Sam's eyes hardened. He didn't need to hear another word. He gestured to his deputies, and within seconds, Jason was being hauled up and cuffed. The sound of the metal ratcheting shut was the most beautiful music I'd heard all day. But as they led Jason away, I walked toward the gate. I didn't care about the groom anymore. I cared about the man with the camera. As I got closer, the man didn't stop filming. He kept the lens leveled at my face, a small red light blinking on the side of the housing. He was young, maybe 30, with a trendy undercut and a smirk that suggested he thought he was the smartest person in the zip code. Gary and Linda stood behind him, no longer looking like parents, but like employees waiting for a rap call. "Mr. Carter," the cameraman said, his voice dripping with a polished, urban arrogance, "you really shouldn't have interfered. You've just turned a high-end lifestyle feature into a dark web snuff piece on your own reputation. Do you have any idea how many people are watching this live?" I felt a cold prickle of dread. "Who are you?" "I'm the content director for Elite Exposure," he said, tapping a logo on his jacket I hadn't noticed before. "We weren't just here to film a wedding. We were here to film a downfall. The hillbilly billionaire and the social climber." That was the working title. Jason was our lead actor, though he didn't know the full script. He thought he was just getting a cut of the blackmail. We were going to make sure your daughter's humiliation went viral enough to tank your commercial holdings stock. A little reputation management nightmare to force you into a buyout. I felt the ground shift beneath my boots. This wasn't just a wedding scam. It was a corporate assassination disguised as a family drama. They had used Sarah's vanity and Jason's greed to create a reality show designed to destroy the Carter legacy. Every tear Sarah had shed, every moment of my exclusion, every bit of drama at the gate, it had all been fodder for a global audience of people who loved to see the wealthy fall. What happened next was the moment the builder in me took over the father. Sarah stepped forward, her voice no longer trembling. She looked at the camera, then at the man holding it. "You've been filming me all day? When I was crying in the dressing room? When I was begging Jason to talk to me?" "It's great TV, Sarah," the man said, not even looking away from the viewfinder. "The betrayed bride pulls millions of views. You're going to be famous, just not the way you wanted." Sarah didn't scream. She didn't throw a punch. She turned to me, her eyes as cold and sharp as industrial diamonds. "Dad, you said you own this resort. You said you own the hospitality group." "I do, Sarah," I said, sensing where she was going. "Then you own the media rights to everything filmed on this private property without a commercial permit, don't you?" I looked at the cameraman. The smirk on his face faltered for the first time. "In construction, you learn that every site has a set of rules. If you don't follow the permits, the city tears your building down." The Golden Oaks Resort had a very strict ironclad policy regarding professional filming. It was written into every contract to protect the privacy of the celebrities who stayed there. Without a signed release from the majority shareholder, any footage taken on these grounds for commercial use was legally considered stolen property. "Sam," I shouted to the sheriff, "I want that camera seized as evidence of illegal surveillance and corporate espionage. And I want those 3 trespassed from every property owned by the Carter Holding Group. That includes the hotel they're staying in downtown." The cameraman's eyes went wide. "Wait, you can't do that. This is a First Amendment issue." "This is private property," I said, stepping into his personal space, my shadow looming over him. "And you just admitted on camera, which is still recording, by the way, that you were here to commit blackmail and securities fraud. Sam, take the equipment." As the deputies moved in to strip the content director of his gear, the man started babbling about his company lawyers and digital distribution, but I wasn't listening. I was looking at Sarah. She had walked over to the mud where Jason had been lying. She reached down and picked up something small and glinting. It was the vintage engagement ring Jason had given her. She looked at it for a second, then handed it to me. "It's a fake, Dad," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I took it to a jeweler 3 weeks ago because I wanted to get it insured. It's glass, just like everything else he gave me." I looked at the ring, then at my daughter. "Why didn't you leave him then, Sarah? Why did you go through with the wedding, if you knew?" She looked up at the dark resort, at the place she had spent a year dreaming about. "Because I thought if I could just make the wedding perfect, if I could just get to the other side of the I do's, then I could change him. I thought I was the one in control. I thought the aesthetic would save me from the truth. I was so ashamed of where I came from that I let myself be tricked by a man who came from nowhere." She looked at my rough, calloused hands, then at the old truck. "I let them draw a red X over your face, Dad. I'm the one who told the guard to keep you out. I did that. Not Jason, not the cameraman, me. That was the rock bottom. The moment where the foundation doesn't just crack, it turns to dust." Seeing my daughter stand in the ruins of her own vanity, admitting that she was the architect of her own misery, was harder than any betrayal Jason could have cooked up. I didn't offer her a platitude. I didn't tell her it was okay. I just looked at her and said, "The problem with building on a lie, Sarah, is that you eventually have to live in it." And tonight, the roof fell in. But as the sheriff's deputies began to clear the scene, and the content team was loaded into the back of a van, Sarah did something I didn't expect. She didn't ask to go home. She didn't ask for a towel or a warm bed. "The live stream," she said, turning to look at the tablet still sitting on my dashboard. "Is it still going? Is Reynolds still recording?" "He is," I said. "Good," she said, straightening her shoulders, the silk of her dress rustling in the wind. "Turn it up. I want the world to see the hillbilly billionaire one more time. But this time, I want them to see the man who's going to buy the company that tried to ruin him." I stared at her. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" "The parent company of Elite Exposure," she said, a cold, calculating look in her eye that reminded me exactly of myself when I was fighting for my first multi-million-dollar contract. They're a shell company based out of Atlanta. They've been shorting your stock all week, Dad. They're betting on our downfall. But if we show the world the truth right now, if we show them the police reports, the fake parents, and the fraud, the stock is going to bounce. And while it's bouncing, we're going to use the liquid capital you have in the trust to buy the majority of their debt. I felt a slow, dark grin spread across my face. I didn't know it yet, but my daughter hadn't just learned a lesson. She had found her teeth. Revenge is a slow build, Sarah, I cautioned. I don't want a slow build, Dad, she said, looking back at the resort. I want a total demolition. I want to own the company that tried to turn my life into a joke. And then, I want to fire everyone who watched the feed and didn't call for help. What happened next was the beginning of a reversal so total it would be talked about in the Georgia business journals for a decade. But as we turned to walk back to the truck, to start the process of buying out our enemies, a single, black car pulled up to the gate. It wasn't a police car. It wasn't an SUV. It was a vintage Rolls-Royce, the kind that only one person in the state of Georgia drove. The window rolled down, and a man with silver hair and eyes like frozen steel looked out at us. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice like velvet over gravel, "I hear there's a property for sale, and I think you and I have some business to discuss regarding your son-in-law's outstanding debts." It was Moretti, the real Moretti, and he didn't look like he was here for a family meeting. I stood in front of Sarah, my hand tightening on the pry bar. The aesthetic was gone, but the real danger was just beginning. The silence that settled over the gate was different now. It wasn't the empty silence of a power outage. It was the heavy, electrified silence that happens right before a lightning strike. Moretti's Rolls-Royce sat idling, the engine a low, predatory hum that seemed to vibrate in the soles of my boots. Sheriff Sam Miller stood frozen, his hand still on the door of his cruiser. He knew who was in that car. Everyone in Georgia who had ever tried to pour a foundation or secure a liquor license knew that when the silver-haired man appeared, the rules of the game changed. I kept my arm around Sarah, feeling her pulse thrumming against my side. She was staring at the Rolls-Royce with a look of pure, unadulterated fascination. The fear was there, sure, but it was being pushed aside by something colder, a curiosity I hadn't seen in her since she was 7 years old and watching me blast through a granite shelf to lay a basement. She was looking at power, real power, not the rented, glossy version Jason had sold her, but the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be heard. Moretti stepped out of the car. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first house, and he moved with a deliberate, slow grace. He didn't look like a mobster from the movies. He looked like a grandfather who happened to own the city. He walked past the sheriff as if Sam were a decorative shrub and stopped 5 feet from me. "Bill," Moretti said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone. "It's been a long time. I believe the last time we spoke, you were telling me that my architect was an idiot, and that the north wing of my lodge was going to slide into the lake if we didn't use more rebar. And was I right, Lorenzo?" I asked, my grip tightening on the pry bar. I wasn't going to drop it just because he was being polite. Moretti smiled, a thin, sharp expression that didn't reach his frozen steel eyes. "The lodge hasn't moved an inch in 20 years. You're a man of your word, Bill. Which is why I was surprised to hear from my associates that you were throwing my name around tonight to scare off 2 of my least favorite collectors." I didn't blink. "I did what I had to do to protect my daughter. Your boys were out of line, Lorenzo. They were trying to use a family dispute to squeeze a man who doesn't owe them a dime." Moretti glanced at Sarah, then at the ruined resort behind us. "A family dispute. Is that what we're calling this? I call it a missed opportunity. You see, Bill, your son-in-law, the one currently weeping in the back of that cruiser, didn't just owe me money. He tried to sell me something that didn't belong to him. He came to me 3 days ago with a deed to a 3-acre plot of land by the river. A cabin, he said, worth millions in development value once the old man was out of the way." I felt a cold, jagged spike of rage pierce my chest. The cabin, my cabin, the place where I'd raised Sarah, where Catherine's spirit still lingered in every floorboard I'd laid. Jason hadn't just been forging Sarah's name. He had been trying to sell the one thing I had left that truly mattered. He had been brokering my life while I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and thinking about his wedding gift. Sarah's breath hitched. "He tried to sell the cabin. Dad, he told me we were going to modernize it for your retirement. He said he was setting up a trust so you'd never have to worry about maintenance." "He was setting up a funeral, Sarah," I said. my voice thick with a bitterness I couldn't swallow. Moretti stepped closer, his gaze shifting to the sheriff. Sam, why don't you take your boys and that loudmouth in the back and head down to the station? I'd like to have a private word with my old friend. I promise, no one is going to disappear tonight. I'm just here to settle a ledger. Sam hesitated, looking at me. I gave him a short nod. I knew Moretti. For all his faults, he was a man of old-school codes. He wouldn't hurt me in front of my daughter, and he wouldn't do it while the law was watching. Sam sighed, tipped his hat, and began the process of clearing the scene. Within minutes, the sirens were fading down the hill, leaving us alone in the yellow glow of the security lights. I didn't know it yet, Moretti said, looking at the tablet on my dashboard, but your daughter has a very sharp mind for business. I've been watching the Elite Exposure feed. They're based in a building I happen to own in Atlanta. They've been quite a nuisance lately, thinking they can operate without a proper, local partnership. Sarah stepped away from me, her muddy heels clicking on the gravel. Mr. Moretti, if you own their building, then you know their servers are on site. You know where they keep the raw footage from tonight. The footage they didn't get a chance to edit to make us look like fools. Moretti arched an eyebrow. I do. And I know that their stock is currently plummeting because people are realizing the hillbilly billionaire isn't as easy to knock down as they thought. What's your point, Sarah? My point, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, more predatory, is that if you help us secure that footage, the real footage of Jason's confession and the blackmail attempt, I can make sure your partnership with that media group becomes a permanent ownership. We buy them out tomorrow at the bottom of the dip. You get the real estate and a clean media wing. We get the evidence that clears our name and destroys everyone who tried to profit from this night. I watched her, stunned. This was the girl who 6 hours ago was crying because her orchids weren't the right shade of white. Now, she was negotiating with the most dangerous man in Georgia, using her own humiliation as a market leverage point. I'd spent 20 years trying to keep her out of the dirt, but it turned out the dirt was where she thrived. She wasn't just a carter. She was a builder of a different kind. She built traps. Moretti laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Bill, you've been hiding a shark in your house. I like her. She has the Carter grit, but none of the Carter sentimentality. He looked at me. What do you say, Bill? Do we go into business for one night? I want my money from Jason, and since he's headed for a sell, I'll take his commission from the media group instead. You get your reputation, and I get a new toy. I looked at the pry bar in my hand, then at my daughter. The aesthetic of my life had been one of quiet labor and simple truths. But the world had changed. The people who had tried to erase me didn't understand sweat. They understood data and leverage. If I wanted to save Sarah from the fallout of this night, I had to stop building bridges and start burning them. One night, Lorenzo, I said, but my daughter handles the digital side. I handle the demolition. Deal, Moretti said. He reached into his car and pulled out a cell phone. I'm sending my tech team to the Atlanta office now. Reynolds, you still there? The PI's voice crackled through the tablet. I'm here, Mr. Moretti. I've already got a back door into their live stream server. I'm just waiting for the go-ahead to dump the director's cut. Wait, Sarah said, grabbing the tablet. Don't dump it yet. I want Jason to see it first. I want him to sit in that cell tonight, thinking he's won, thinking he's the victim. I want him to watch the news tomorrow morning and realize that he didn't just lose the wedding, he lost the play. What happened over the next 4 hours was a masterclass in psychological warfare. We didn't go home. We drove to a small, private office Moretti kept in the back of a high-end steakhouse downtown. Sarah sat at a bank of computers, her ruined wedding dress shimmering under the fluorescent lights, her fingers flying across the keys. She was working with Reynolds and Moretti's people, tracing the breadcrumbs of Jason's lies. As the sun began to peek over the Georgia pines, the truth finally emerged. It wasn't just Jason. It wasn't just the media group. There was a third party, a silent investor, who had provided the seed money for Jason's nebulous scam, a person who knew me, a person who knew the exact value of my holdings. Dad, Sarah whispered, her face going pale as a document loaded on the screen. You need to see this. I walked over and looked at the screen. It was an email chain from 6 months ago. The sender wasn't a tech mogul or a loan shark. It was a name I recognized instantly. It was the man who had been my business partner for 15 years before I retired. The man I had trusted to take care of my legacy. 2. J. Miller, Re. Carter Liquidations. Focus on the river acreage first. The old man is sentimental about the cabin. If you can break his heart, he'll sign anything, just to make the pain stop. I'll handle the corporate side. We split the buyout sao mui, bon mui, once the stock hits the floor. I felt like I'd been hit by a wrecking ball. The betrayal wasn't just a son-in-law or a greedy media company. It was my best friend, the man who had stood by me when Catherine died. He had been the one whispering in Jason's ear, coaching him on how to hurt me. He had turned my daughter into a weapon to use against me. I didn't know it yet, I said, my voice barely a growl, but the wedding wasn't the end of the scam, it was the distraction. While we were at the resort, fighting over guest lists and aesthetics, my old partner had been filing the paperwork to trigger a hostile takeover of my commercial trust, using the scandal of the wedding as proof that I was mentally unfit to manage my assets. He was going to use my daughter's public shaming as the final nail in my professional coffin. Sarah looked at me, and for the first time that night, she didn't look like a bride or an executive. She looked like my little girl. Dad, what do we do? He's already filed the motion with the board. I looked at the clock. Saw, muy lum a.m. The board meeting was at Chin, Hong a.m. What do we do? I repeated. I reached out and touched the screen, my calloused finger resting on my former partner's name. We do what we always do when a structure is condemned, Sarah. We clear the site. I turned to Moretti, who was sipping a cup of espresso, watching us with a bored sort of amusement. Lorenzo, I need a favor. I need a ride to the Carter building downtown. And I need you to bring your most sophisticated legal team. We're going to a board meeting. And the footage? Sarah asked, her hand hovering over the upload button. Wait until I'm in the room, I said. I want to see his face when the hillbilly billionaire walks in with the truth. I want him to realize that when you try to tear down a Carter, you'd better make sure you've pulled the power first. The drive downtown was silent. Sarah sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce, staring out at the city she had tried so hard to conquer with lies. She was quiet, but I could see her jaw working. She was rehearsing. She was sharpening her blades. We reached the Carter building, a 30-story glass and steel tower. I'd finished in Hangin Lea Muri High, just as the city was waking up. The lobby was bustling with people in suits, the very people Sarah had envied. They looked at us as we walked in, a man in a worn tuxedo and work boots, and a woman in a mud-stained wedding dress. They whispered. They stared. They probably thought we were a joke. But as the elevator doors closed and we began our ascent to the penthouse boardroom, I looked at Sarah's reflection in the polished chrome. She wasn't hiding her face. She wasn't ashamed. She looked like a woman who was about to take back everything that had been stolen from her. I didn't know it yet, I thought as the floor numbers climbed, but this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about the future. And my old partner was about to find out that a building is only as strong as the man who owns the dirt. The doors chimed. The boardroom was ahead. I could see my former partner, Mark, sitting at the head of the table, a smug smile on his face as he addressed the board. He was holding a copy of the morning paper, the headline screaming about the wedding chaos at Golden Oaks. He thinks he's won, Dad, Sarah whispered. Let him think it for 10 more seconds, I said. I kicked the double doors open with the toe of my work boot. The room went silent. Mark's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, frozen horror. He looked at me, then at the mud on Sarah's dress, and then at Moretti, who was leaning against the doorframe behind us. Bill? Mark stammered, dropping the newspaper. What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. There's a motion. The board is discussing your health. My health is fine, Mark, I said, walking toward the head of the table. I didn't stop until I was inches from his face. But your career? That's about to experience a total structural collapse. I looked at Sarah. Now. She pressed the button on her phone. Across the massive LED screens in the boardroom, the real footage began to play. Not the edited gossip, but the raw, brutal truth of the night. But the final twist, the one that would bring the entire building down on Mark's head, was something even I hadn't expected to find in the digital files. It turned out Mark hadn't just been coaching Jason. He had been doing something much, much worse. The high-definition LED screens in the boardroom, usually reserved for quarterly earnings and architectural renderings, flickered with a raw, grainy feed. It wasn't the elite exposure live stream anymore. Sarah had bypassed the flashy graphics and the dramatic music. She had gone straight into Mark's private, encrypted cloud, the digital safe room, where men like him hide the parts of their souls they don't want the world to see. Mark stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the mahogany table, The smugness hadn't just left his face, it had been replaced by a look of visceral, gut-wrenching terror. He looked like a man watching his own execution in real time. "Bill, wait," Mark stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "This is private property. You're violating a dozen privacy laws. Board members, I apologize for this intrusion. Security is on the way." "Sit down, Mark," one of the board members barked. It was Henderson, the eldest on the board, and a man who valued loyalty above all else. "We want to see what Sarah found." The video on the screen wasn't from the wedding. It was a recording from Mark's own home office, dated 6 months ago. It showed Mark and Jason, my son-in-law, the tech visionary, sitting in plush leather chairs, drinking my favorite bourbon. "You have to make her love you, Jason," Mark's voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers. "Sarah is the key. Bill won't give the company to me. He's too tied to the legacy crap. But if you're his son-in-law, and you convince her he's losing his grip, if we can get him declared incompetent, the trust defaults to her. And since you'll have her power of attorney, it defaults to you, which means it defaults to us." Jason's voice came through next, sounding bored and arrogant. "She's easy, Dad. She's so desperate to be elite that she'll believe anything, as long as it's whispered in a French accent. But what about the old man? He's tougher than he looks." The room went deathly silent. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Dad?" I looked at Mark, then back at the screen. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Jason wasn't just a random con man Mark had recruited. Jason was Mark's biological son, the product of a secret affair Mark had carried on for decades while we were building this empire together. He hadn't just betrayed our business. He had spent 30 years hiding an entire family while living off the profits of my labor. He had planted his own blood in my house to harvest my life's work. But the knife went deeper. The video skipped forward. Another date. 3 years ago, just before my wife, Catherine, passed away. Mark was on the phone, his back to the camera. "No, don't release the funds for the specialist in Zurich yet. Tell Bill the insurance is still pending. By the time he realizes the trust is being audited, it'll be too late for her anyway. If Catherine recovers, Bill stays in the CEO chair for another decade. If she doesn't, he'll be too broken to fight the restructuring. We need him distracted by grief, not focused on the books." I felt a roar begin to build in my chest. A primal, jagged sound that started in my boots. I didn't even realize I had moved until my hands were around Mark's silk tie, slamming him back against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass groaned, the very glass I had inspected for safety a decade ago. "You killed her," I hissed, my face inches from his. "You didn't just steal the money, you stole her time. You let her die so you could have a bigger office." Mark clawed at my wrists, his eyes bulging. "It was business, Bill. You were never going to step down. You were obsessed with the dirt. I did what I had to do for my son." "Your son is a parasite," I growled, "and you're the rot that birthed him." "Dad." Sarah's voice cut through the red haze. I looked back. She was standing by the monitors, her face wet with tears, but her hand was steady on the keyboard. She wasn't looking at me with fear. She was looking at me with the same cold resolve I'd seen earlier. "Don't break the glass, Dad," she said, her voice like ice. "He's not worth the cleanup. The sheriff is already downstairs. Moretti's lawyers have the wire transfers. They tracked the money Mark siphoned from Mom's medical fund into Jason's offshore accounts. Every penny, every lie, it's all here." I let go of Mark. He slumped to the floor, a pathetic heap of expensive wool and cheap morals. I looked at the board members. They were staring at him with a disgust that no amount of profit could wash away. "The motion is denied," Henderson said, his voice trembling with rage. "Mark Stone, you are hereby stripped of all titles and shares in Carter Holdings, pending a full criminal investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and whatever the hell we call what you did to Catherine." Moretti, who had been leaning silently against the door, straightened his jacket. He walked over to Mark and looked down at him as if he were a bug on the sidewalk. "You know, Mark, I don't like men who involve families in their scams. It's messy, and it's bad for the aesthetic of the city. My boys will be waiting for you when the police are done. We have a very different way of auditing books." Mark was let out in handcuffs 10 minutes later. He didn't look back. He didn't say a word. He went out into the morning light of the city he had tried to steal, and for the first time in 10 years, the building felt clean. 6 months later, The Georgia sun was setting behind the pine trees, casting long, golden shadows across the porch of my cabin. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke and the river. I was sitting in my old leather recliner, a glass of iced tea in my hand. The 1990 Tam Ford F150 was parked in its usual spot, but it looked different now. It was clean. The rust on the fenders had been sanded down and primed, and the engine gave a soft, contented purr instead of the old rattle. Sarah walked out of the cabin, wearing a pair of denim work pants and a simple cotton shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had a smear of grease on her forehead. She had spent the afternoon helping me replace the floorboards in the kitchen, the ones I'd been meaning to fix since Catherine died. "The joists are solid, Dad," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "We can start the sanding tomorrow." I looked at her and smiled. She wasn't a creative director anymore. She was the chief operations officer of Carter Holdings, but on the weekends, she was just my daughter. She had sold her designer bags, closed her social media accounts, and moved into the small guest house on the property. She had spent the last 6 months in the dirt with me. She had visited every job site, talked to every foreman, and learned how to read a blueprint until she could see the soul of a building before the first stone was turned. She didn't care about the aesthetic anymore. She cared about the foundation. "You did good today, Sarah," I said. She sat down on the porch steps, looking out at the woods. "I keep thinking about that night, Dad. The X on your face, the darkness in the ballroom. Sometimes I wake up and I can still hear the sound of the lights going out." "The lights had to go out so you could see who was standing in the room with you, honey," I said. She nodded slowly. "I thought I wanted to be elite. I thought I wanted to belong to a world that looked perfect from the outside. But I realized, perfection is just a thin coat of paint. Real life is the stuff underneath. It's the sweat. It's the calluses. It's the man who drives 6 hours in a rattling truck just to make sure his daughter isn't alone." She reached out and took my hand. Her palm was rough now. It had the same small scars as mine, marks of a life spent building, not just consuming. "I'm sorry I was ashamed of you," she whispered. "You weren't ashamed of me, Sarah," I said, squeezing her hand. "You were just lost in the fog. Everyone gets lost sometimes. The trick is knowing who's going to keep the porch light on for you until you find your way back." The news had reported that Jason was serving 15 years for securities fraud and identity theft. Mark was in a federal facility, his assets seized, his empire dissolved into the Carter Trust. The elite exposure group had folded after the raw footage went viral, their reputation destroyed by the very truth they claimed to trade in. But as the stars began to poke through the Georgia sky, I didn't think about them. I didn't think about the revenge, or the money, or the glass tower downtown. I thought about the night Sarah was born, and how I had promised Catherine I would give her the world. I realized then that I hadn't failed that promise. I had just been giving her the wrong world. She didn't need a penthouse or a visionary husband. She needed to know that she was a Carter, that she was made of the same steel and stone as the buildings that bore our name. "Dad," Sarah asked, looking up at the moon. "Yeah, honey? Tomorrow morning. Can we take the truck into town? I want to get some more of that heavy-duty sealant. And maybe some breakfast at that diner by the highway, the one with the black coffee." I laughed, a deep, easy sound that echoed off the river. "I think the truck can handle that, Sarah, as long as you don't mind the lack of AC. "I don't mind," she said, leaning her head against my shoulder. "I like the way the wind feels." We sat there, in the quiet of the woods, two builders resting after a long day's work. The house was solid, the foundation was deep, and for the first time in a very long time, the lights were on, and they were never going out again. We often spend our lives trying to polish the surface, terrified that the world will see our rough edges. But a life built on an aesthetic is a house built on sand. True wealth isn't the gold on your finger or the name on your building. It's the calluses on your hands and the people who will stand in the dark with you when the power fails. Never be ashamed of the dirt. It's the only thing that grows anything real.